Start recording. I think it is recording. Up here. Hello, everybody. I'm Dewey. So, who am I? This is my pixel art talk, how to say a lot with a little. First up, who am I if you haven't met me before? I know a lot of you in here, but if you haven't met me before, I am the former president of Spartasoft. I was last year, and I am no longer because I am a graduate student, so I am finished my undergrad. I went through the game design program, helped Spartasoft, and now I'm teaching MI247, stuff like that. And I'm a 3D character artist. And I know what you're thinking. Wait, what? What gives you the right? What gives you that authority? How dare you come into our club and talk to us about 2D art, you dirty 3D artist? And to that I say, Plunder Panic is why I can talk about this. And the 326 hours I put into A-Sprite since I found it halfway through the summer. So that's only about half my summer was that 300-something hours of making pixel art. If you don't know about Plunder Panic, which I hope you do, it's down the hallway a little bit. It's our award-winning game developed by the Gel Lab. It was my job, or I'm working on bringing it to the Nintendo Switch. It's going to be released on Steam, so I'm trying to make it as professional as possible. You can go play it in the lobby. My job was to replace almost every environment asset in the game. So here's what the game used to look like. It was initially developed in about 2 months for the Traverse City Film Festival. And there were a lot of bad decisions that were made at this point. It's decent, it functioned. I can't say that Ryan and Darlene did a terrible job. You know, they had a very short amount of time to develop the game, but they broke a lot of rules, and they could have done a lot of stuff better, so I took this and I turned it into this. So, before, after, using my knowledge of pixel art and some of the research that I've done and practice that I've done. I did a lot of animation over the summer. I did a lot of animation over the summer. A lot of animation over the summer. I was spending every day doing pixel art, animating, to make this game look great, and I learned a lot along the way. But that just because I have done all this does not mean I'm the best. See right here, we got some nice metal slug art, which is insane. So why use pixel art? Limitation breeds creativity. A lot of times, the blank canvas is the most difficult thing to handle in art, where you have no direction. And the first thing you should do for yourself is to set limitations. And pixel art is entirely about limitations. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Got those retro and nostalgic vibes. If you like the way old games look, maybe you want to invoke that. Maybe you just really like it stylistically. And last, implication is powerful. A lot of times, the information your brain creates to fill in the gaps that you don't necessarily have provided to you is a lot more powerful than explicitly telling the viewer what they need to interpret or see. So the fact that you're using low-resolution art could be a way of implying things as opposed to just directly stating them to the audience. And so what makes good pixel art? Good pixel art is easy to read. That should be consistent over all your art. You should be able to tell what you're looking at when you're looking at it. Things like silhouette, good use of color, lots of stuff like that. Art concepts to make sure that the player knows what they're looking at when they're looking at pixel art. It needs to be accurate. What you make in pixel art should portray what it is that you want to portray. People think like you don't need those art fundamentals, but you definitely do. You need to be able to accurately render whatever it is you're making in pixels, which presents a lot of difficult challenges. And pixel art should be visually appealing. These three things are pretty common with any art that you do. It should be easy to read, it should be accurate, it should be visually appealing, because that will just make your game better. But the last thing good pixel art is difficult. A lot of people say, oh, we're just going to make pixel art because it'll make it easier, it'll make it faster. We're not good artists. But here's the problem. If you yourself aren't a good artist and you make pixel art, you didn't make decent art, you just made bad pixel art. You didn't make decent art. So, how do we make sure we're making good pixel art? So here's your challenge. You're making pixel art for your game. What you need to do is convey as much information as possible with what limited information you have. Whether that be limited resolution, or limited palette. Generally, pixel art is run at a lower resolution than your actual display, so you have to work with less information. If you're trying to invoke, an old system, if you're trying to make a game that looks like it's on the SNES or the NES or whatever you choose, you have a limited palette. The hardware back then couldn't physically handle running all those colors, so you need to be able to work within those constraints. On top of that, you need to make the audience forget that they're looking at pixel art. Back when the Super Nintendo came out, back when the NES came out, people didn't think, man, this looks really pixely and blocky. They thought it looked amazing. They didn't even notice it was pixel art, actually. Because if you look at pixel art on a CRT, it looks totally different than pixel art on crazy HD displays that we have now. Brings me to my next point. You need to make the audience forget that they have HD displays. You want them to convince them that what they're looking at was made for this display, and that's the way they should be looking at it. And then last, and probably really important, very, very crucial to this whole process, is don't break any of the rules. Either the cardinal sins, which we're going to go over just a second, or any self-imposed limitations. When I say self-imposed limitations, I mean whatever resolution you pick and whether you're choosing a limited palette. Talking about limited palette, if you do pixel art and you don't have at least some restriction to the amount of colors you use either in the entire screen or from asset to asset, you're not making pixel art anymore, you're just making low resolution regular art. So part of the charm and the character that comes from pixel art is holding yourself to those limitations. Remember, limitation breeds creativity. You have to find a creative way to solve a problem that you didn't have before. So, the cardinal sins featuring Otis. These are things that are going to happen within Unity that you need to avoid. And I talked about Plunder Panic. Plunder Panic breaks cardinal sins, but I can't help it because the game was established a year and a half ago, and I have to work with what I got. If I was going to go back and do it again, I'd make sure I don't break any of these cardinal sins. So first up, thou shalt not rotate thine art without care. Pixel art exists on a grid. It's a bunch of squares placed next to each other, right? Those squares can't rotate. Pixels on your screen cannot rotate. If you were making a game on an actual display that had a lower resolution, those pixels can't rotate. They are stuck in space. So when you're working on a high resolution display and you have 1920 by 1080 or whatever, and you say, well, I need my character to be at a 45-degree angle, you can't just take them and rotate them that little bit. Because as soon as that happens, at those 45-degree angles, those diamonds, those couldn't exist in pixel art. What you're going to have to do is either rotate it within your animation or use a screen space filter. You're going to get something kind of like this. That's because the renderer is reinterpreting the color and replacing it out as pixels. Instead of just rotating those squares, you're moving the pixels to new locations. As you can see, it's ruining all that carefully placed detail that you put in. You decided, hey, I want his eyes to be here, this far apart. Well, it's going to get ruined when it gets rotated slightly. So don't rotate within your scene in Unity unless you have a screen space filter or those rotations are built into the animations. And if you have to rotate, or try to avoid rotation as much as possible. And if you have to, use those constraints. Because no rixels, no rotated pixels. 2, thou shalt always carefully consider scale. Like I said, modern displays have a lot of resolution. Your game should have a pseudo resolution. Before you start making your game, before you start making that art for the game, you need to say, okay, yes, the game is going to be played at 1080, but our pixel resolution, our theoretical resolution, our de facto resolution is X. Plunder Panic is 960 by 540 because it's 1/2 of 1080. So we picked that, we went by that, and that determined our pixel density on the screen. When you decide that pixel resolution, that single pixel is the smallest amount of information you can give to the audience. You cannot go any smaller. So if you need your character to get smaller, that doesn't work. Those pixels now couldn't play. This is what your pixel art should look like. Scale it down. You're reassigning that color to a new space. Also, doesn't work the other way as well. You can't just scale your characters up without care. Because, get this, ugly, horrible amalgamation of doubled up pixels and sliced pixels. We're working on Plunder Panic on the Switch. If you pull it and put it into docked mode, you go from that 1080 display to the 720 display. A lot of that happens because the game doesn't work with the resolution quite right. This is a decision you need to make early on. Pick a resolution that can scale. Pick a resolution that looks good, you know, at 1080, at 720, whatever, and avoid slicing and doubling as much as possible. That's scaling. And last, thou shalt not deviate from the grid. It's a grid. I said that both other times. Pixels can only exist at one spot on each screen. They can't exist halfway between two pixels. Ideally, when you set up your game, you will set it up in a way that pixels cannot exist in those halfway states. There are a couple ways around it, but the thing is, this is a little bit more fudgeable. If you have characters that are sliding around and standing at the half pixel mark, people might not notice it. But if you want to be true pixel art, which you should always aim for, because pixel art is best when the illusion is kept, you need to make sure that no pixels exist in that halfway point. A couple ways you can do that. Setting your Unity unit to be 1 pixel. And that way, you can constrain all your translation values to those units, and then you know for a fact nothing will ever be off of those units. You can also use a screen space filter to adjust the resolution and make sure all of your pixels stay perfect. And like I said, normalize those translation values to the grid. Or you could even set it to 1 pixel at, or 10 pixels per unit. Oh, that's something I didn't talk about with scale, pixels per unit. If you don't know about this, you should definitely know about it for pixel art. In Unity, in the import settings for sprites, there's a field that says pixels per unit. That is how many pixels of that asset are going to fill up a unit. Pretty self-explanatory. But what people fail to realize is that's really crucial for keeping everything the same scale. Plunder Panic before had a bunch of assets that were just randomly scaled and didn't have a consistent density. That kind of thing can't exist on a low resolution display. So choose a pixels per unit density before you start making your assets. That way you can say, all right, I want this object to occupy this much of the screen. It needs to be this number of pixels by this number of pixels. Plunder Panic runs at 24 pixels per unit. So every unit we have in the game screen is 24 pixels. Then Azul right here, totally irrelevant. It's just about a grid, but it's a really fun board game, so go play it. It's about laying tiles, so I guess that's kind of relevant. You're a tile layer. So yeah, the 3 sins. Don't rotate, don't scale, stick to the grid. As long as you do those things, your pixel art will look convincing, and you will effectively make a cohesive pixel art aesthetic. You can't cut corners with this, and a lot of people think that pixel art's easy, but then they're not actually sticking to the rules. They're rotating things around, they're scaling them, and that's totally out of the question for making some legitimate pixel art. Maybe you're saying I'm a purist, but I think it's lazy if you just make pixel art and just do what you want with it, because this is how pixel art's supposed to work. It's all about maintaining that illusion. So what you need to make good shit. First off, fundamentals of drawing. Like I said, pixel art is not an excuse to be a bad artist. You need to still understand those fundamental concepts of composition, of how to accurately capture an object on a piece of paper by sculpting it or by drawing it out with pixels. You need to understand light and color. A lot of interesting aesthetics come from the way you color scheme something, the way light affects it. The thing about pixel art is you have to color it all yourself. The better you are at understanding light and color, the better it's going to look at the end. And last is a grasp on animation. Anybody who's taken 247 or 347 has gone over the 12 fundamentals of animation. When I was animating for Plunder Panic this summer, I was constantly using those concepts every single time I did an animation to make sure it looked snappy, to make sure it conveyed information to the player, to make it satisfying. I need to have an acute understanding of what makes animation work. How do I make it effective? And last, A-Sprite. You don't need this, but I think you should find the right tool for the job. Photoshop sucks for pixel art. Don't use it. You can, but it's just terrible. Get A-Sprite. It's like $15, or there are ways to get it for free. and it's specifically designed for pixel art and pixel art animation, and it is very, very good at that. You can export as sprite sheets. You can do palette swapping on sprites way easier than you could with Photoshop. There are alternatives out there. There's like graphic scale and stuff like that, and those will work, but I just like a sprite. It's also on Steam, so you can see the number of hours you have tick up, which I liked a lot. All right, so a little bit of a case study. Chest. This is something I made for Plunder Panic. This is in the game. If you played it, you turn around, you pick up gold, and you can drop it in the chest. And when you add gold to the chest, it fills up, and it has kind of these 3 tiers. So I had a couple jobs. I had to make it reactive to the player. As they passed by it, they needed to know, like, this is something they can touch. I also needed to indicate to them how much gold they had in the chest relatively. Like, I didn't have exact indication to them, but I could say some, a little bit more, and a lot. So that's what I did. So we're going to go through kind of my process and how I handled making this asset. The first step is usually sketch. I will either block out just like normally by drawing with, when I do pixel art, I use a tablet. You don't have to. A lot of people don't. I do because I got used to it that way. I'll draw out a sketch. I won't worry too much about making my lines perfect because lines in pixel art are very difficult, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And I do those keyframes. Going back to those fundamentals of animation, those key points in time that are going to be the areas of emphasis. In this case, these are the 5 states that the chest could be in. It could be closed, be open, have little, medium, and a lot of treasure. And I just drew them out and set them in space or in time on my timeline within a sprite. I'm not worrying too much about color at this point. It's just the sketch. What I'll do then is I'll probably time things out. I'll just duplicate frames until the timing between these states makes sense to me. Then, once I have things timed out, I hop on over to my in-betweens. This is where I start going from one state to the next. This is where the crunchiness comes in. This is where I get this thing to feel nice to interact with. So, we look up there, I had to get it to open, so I didn't just like slowly make it open. I had it whip open, and then that energy transferred to the rest of the chest. It picks up off the ground, and you can feel it kind of like cha-chung. And that was actually really easy. I just had like one frame of it snapping open, and then it hops up, and then it lands and bounces. And then I use secondary motion. Right when you see it lands, that little the handle bounces up and down. So I have to think about those things. How do I make the motion move through the whole object? I need to keep the energy moving. Then I went from each level of gold. And I didn't want to just kind of like increase. I wanted it to feel punchy. So what I did is I had it like increase and then stop. It accelerates and hits a wall. Of course, when that happens, the gold keeps going. It's got inertia. The gold like hops up and lands back in the chest. So you can see that it makes it feel way snappier. I also added in the little gold shine to give even more emphasis that something has happened. You're indicating to the player through your animation that what they did was good. Generally in game design, in game creation, game development, whatever, you should have 3 pieces of feedback for any action that is important. And it should be like an audio cue, animation cues, UI cues. So I'm just giving as much punch to this to make players feel good when they put gold in the chest. At this point, I add in color. I just use the fill tool, and I just block out the color for what I want. I was talking about limitation. You do want to make sure you keep the number of colors you use to a minimum. Something that I kind of personally do is I don't ever use pure black lines because generally like 100% black and 100% white on your screen is not going to look good. It washes things, or it just totally burns things out, and it loses all dimensionality. So the lines on here are actually like brown tinted with the chest. So I haven't changed much about the animation. I've touched up the lines, so you probably can't tell. There's a couple in between frames where I fixed line work and stuff like that. And I'm just getting that basic dimensionality in there at this point. And then finally, or not finally, next I add in the shading. That's where I go maybe like 2 or 3 colors per overall color. So there's like 3 colors, I think, in the wood, 3 colors in metal, and the gold has like 3 or 4 colors, and then like including the gems, maybe 5. But here, I went a step further. I added another piece of feedback for the player. So when you see the chest open, it pumps up, and then it does that little gold shine. it's just even more secondary motion because I want the player to know something important happened. You have all of these things at your disposal to give feedback to the player. Because as the artist, you're that means of communication between the player, the person who's interacting, and the developers, what their intentions were. And bad art can mean they miss your intention. Let them know what your intentions are by making things punchy. Make it obvious. Use a lot of feedback. And then step 5, palette swap. Palette swapping is so easy in Sprite. You literally just make a new palette, and then you say, I want these colors to be here, and it replaces them in the sprite. And it takes 3 seconds to generate both these iterations on that initial. So that's another reason why I recommend Sprite. You can do it in Photoshop with like indexed colors, because that's what it is. It's a color index, and you just replace colors. But I needed a blue chest and a red chest, and there we go. I have a red chest. So, stepping back a little bit to the basics of pixel art. Back on that grid, we're thinking about how to define a form. First thing you're going to want to do is lay out some contour, some line. It's really not that simple in pixel art. You can't just draw something and call it good, because you might be being a little too ham-fisted with it. The first problem you're going to have is your curved line. And what you try and do is avoid jaggies at all points, jagged lines. And you do this by having a pattern. Start with like a large number, and you go down sequentially with that number, and you grow back to that same number. So here we're going 6, 3, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2. And that's how we get a clean curve. You also want to avoid orphan pixels and things like that in your line, and that's where pixels are like jutting out. It should have definitely had a picture in there for that. But it's really jarring to the viewer when they can see a pixel that's isolated by itself. I could probably draw it if there were stuff up. If we have like a line, you should be thinking about this like you're drawing with like a really thick Sharpie. What you're essentially doing is taking a chunk out of that line and shifting it over a little bit. So you got to be really careful with that. Straight lines are a little easier. Just make sure you're taking the same number of chunks as you're going for line. So it's straight up and down, everything's in line, and then that next part's going 4, 4, 4, 4. One pixel is obviously a 45-degree angle, and then so on and so forth. You can mix and match a little bit, but what you're going to get is zigzagging. And so line weight is really important for when you're working with these simple, sketchy lines. A lot of what I did over the summer working on Plunder Panic was just fixing up my lines. I would sprite something out, and then I'd go through and make sure there's no like floating, jagged edges, just to make sure that it looks like, when I squint my eyes, looks like the thing. It doesn't look like it's a piece of pixel art. Because that's our ultimate goal. We want to convince the person they're looking at whatever we drew, not that they're looking at pixel art. Shading. So, Owlboy, one of the best pixel art games in the game. I reference their website a lot when they talk. They have stuff about pixel art, about scaling, about making sure your scene's set up properly. Because they're hardcore pixel fans, and like it's obvious in Owlboy because it follows those, cardinal sins. They don't break any of them, and it's just heckin' beautiful, dude. So shading. Who here knows what dithering is? Like in art? Anybody? Okay, so dithering is just like checkerboard pattern. Because if you're working in pixel art and you have like two shades and you want to kind of blend them, you could fake it by doing like a checkerboard pattern in between to kind of give it a gradient feel. Try to keep that to a minimum. Dithering can be powerful, but it also can be dangerous. I have that on the next slide. Dithering is dangerous. What you can see here with the pirate ship in Owlboy is they stuck to chunks of color. They did what's called like color banding. And it's really just, they took lines of color and used that for the shading. And then in those little transition areas where they needed texture, they added like the slightest bit of dithering. And it's really effective because probably from the back of the room, you can't tell that that's pixel art. But if you're looking at it on a screen, like if you have Owlboy on your Switch, it's up close. It's very like, you can tell it's pixel art, but it's not hindered by the medium. That's a big thing. You can't let the limitations limit you. You need to use them to creatively propel yourself forward. So like I said, dithering is dangerous. That's dithering right there, where you're faking that gradient from black to white by using kind of checkerboard patterns. The problem with dithering is it really kills depth. The original Thunder Panic art had a lot of dithering, and what it ends up looking like is just that you took an Illustrator gradient and you just kind of took it all the way across. And it doesn't actually give you a good sense of like volume, and it's not great for shading. You can use it for texture, but don't use it to give yourself that kind of halftone shading. It'll just make it noisy. So like I've been saying, we want to make sure the audience sees the object, not an icon. You need those art fundamentals to know how to render out an object. When I'm drawing something in pixel art, I'm not trying to just convey that, oh, it's a treasure chest. I'm trying to convey that it's a treasure chest that exists in 3D space. So understanding how to render something realistically or stylistically, but convincingly, is what you need to know. Don't just draw like a flat chest, you know, like with it's just parallel lines and then it flips open vertically or something like that. You want to have dimensionality, depending on what you need it for. Even if you look at a game like you know, the old Pokemon games, you think like the character sprite's not very dimensional because they have very little to work with. But the rest of the game is very dimensional. You can tell when where a tree is or how tall a fence is compared to your character, because they were focusing on trying to convey what that object was, not an icon to represent that object. If you make icons to represent objects, you end up getting Dwarf Fortress. Which I don't know if any of you know what Dwarf Fortress looks like. I can pull up a picture real quick. If I can get... I love showing people Dwarf Fortress. You get a game that looks like Dwarf Fortress, where it's literally just each square is an icon. You can get fancy tile sets to make it look a little bit better, but still, there's no dimensionality. It's all very flat. That's because the developers of Dwarf Fortress didn't care what it looked like. They just cared that it functioned, and that it functioned really well. And it does, but their art's pretty terrible. And they know that. I'm not knocking them. It's just they made icons. They didn't make art. So, some good inspiration. These are things I've had throughout the slides. Street Fighter Third Strike. Some of the best pixel art in the arcade world. It's super fluid. I have some GIFs back here. There, we got Ibuki and Ryu, and then Chun-Li totally wrecking Ibuki down there in a match. But yeah, somebody went through and hand drew all these frames, and they're buttery smooth. And they're very important because fighting games rely so heavily on animation. They needed to be super accurate. Yeah, look to Third Strike to see how they handle things, because you watch that game screen and you totally forget that it's not just hand-drawn, like, you know, vector art or something, because it's done so well. All the characters have dimensionality, they have weight, because they use those fundamentals of animation. Back to the inspiration. Owlboy. Recent game, made by a small team, and it took them 10 years. So if that's any indication that pixel art is not easy, but it's some of the most beautiful pixel art I've ever seen. Especially the cinematics are crazy to think that they did pixel art and made these like incredibly convincing scenes. That, like, again, at that scale, you can't even tell that that's pixel art. But when you look at it on a screen, it becomes more obvious. They fooled you, and it looks great. And then once you realize it's pixel art, it becomes even better. Go play Owlboy. It's not expensive. Last, we got Metal Slug. Metal Slug is some of my favorite pixel art of all time. It's kind of morbid, but it's also really, you know, crunchy and punchy. I worked on a Lightning for Thunder Panic way back here. I gotta go through all these animations. Right there. I actually kind of ripped that off from Metal Slug because we were making a zombie mode, and that's the lightning that turns you into a zombie in Metal Slug. So kind of a nod to Metal Slug. But Metal Slug is crazy. I actually have that lobster back here, or crab dude. Yeah. How do you do this? Like, I don't understand still. It's so, like, multifaceted, and it's dynamic, but what was somebody look at the resolution for Metal Slug. Like, the Neo Geo is real small. It's not that big. I'm gonna quickly find out what it is. Metal Slug resolution was 320 by 224. That's insane. They fit that into 300 something by 224 pixels. I couldn't do that with an HD display. So if that's a testament to how good they were at their job, like, man. So yeah. We're getting pretty close to what I had prepared. Some resources for you to get better at pixel art. First, we have the Saint 11 tutorials. And I don't know. He's a dude with a Patreon. You can go give him $1 and he'll release all his tutorials to you. Or there's an Imager album that I have linked on these slides that I also have all of these tutorials saved on my computer. If you want them, I can get them. But they're just a bunch of these little slide things that are semi-animated, and they're amazing. There's like 75 of them that I have that have, like, they cover everything. They cover animation topics, they cover how to draw things, they cover how to design characters, and how to shade pixel art, but it's all within the context of pixel art. I found out through him that he was using Sprite to make them all really freaking good. I was constantly referencing this when I was working on Plunder Panic. And maybe once you start looking at these, it'll get kind of obvious that I was, but it's a really good resource, and you can get really good just by using that. Mort on YouTube, he's a pixel art guy. I know Brooke has watched some of his stuff before, so she was nodding at me. But yeah, Mort's great. He has a lot of beginner stuff too to help you learn properly, to learn with those limitations before you kind of go free reign over everything. So check him out on YouTube. Also, non-digital art. I'm telling you, you need to be a good artist to be a good pixel artist. So talk to Andrew, talk to Ricardo, go take a drawing class, do life drawing. Be a good artist before you are a good pixel artist, because it will only make the final result even better. Next, old games, all the pixel art, all the sprite sheets are just available. You can like Google, I don't know, Metal Slug sprite sheets, and it comes up with all the frames of all the art from all the games, and you can just look at how they handled things. And like the Owl Boys I got from back here, like these are actually online somewhere. You can just find all the sprite sheets for Owlboy because they're actually really easy to lift from games. So those, and then last but certainly not least, practice. You have to sit down and do it. I didn't get my pretty okay results by doing it once. I did it every day, 40 hours a week for my job, and that's how I learned so much. So you can't get good without doing it. That's something that we've been trying to convince people of in all of our classes here at MSU with MI 247, 347 portfolio class, is that you're not putting the hours in. You can't be a good animator. You can't be a good pixel artist. You can't be a good 3D artist. You can't be a good designer. You can't be a good programmer. You can't be a good anything without putting in those hours. So I want you all to practice whatever it is you do. Practice some pixel art too with all these great resources. Maybe it can help you make a really cool looking game in a little bit more efficient way. Sometimes pixel art can be faster if you aren't trying to be the best. You should always try to be the best. But yeah, that's what I got on pixel art. I don't know if people have questions. I can totally answer them on how to handle something in pixel art. How long did I take up? Did I take up enough time, or should I like? Okay, cool. I'm totally cool with answering some questions, whether it's about Plunder Panic or something. What's up? So a lot of it is how you think about volume, because in 2D art, you were trying to give the illusion of volume. So you're not thinking about like the actual shape of the object. You're thinking of that projection of the object on a 2D plane. And that's the most difficult part of 3D, or 2D, sorry, is that you don't have the luxury of just, saying, oh, it's got this much diameter, so you give it that much diameter in space. No, you have to convince the viewer that they're seeing something with that much diameter, but it's skewed in such a way, So it's just two different modes of thinking, but if you can draw something well, you can sculpt it well, and if you can sculpt it well, chances are you can draw it well as well. So all those skills are interconnected. So they're different modes of thinking, but they both support each other. Who else wants to know stuff about pixel art? Like tips or... I want to talk about something real quick. I put this one up here for a reason, actually, because one of the biggest things in just like making game art, especially like characters or items and stuff like that, is lighting. And I told you earlier, like, don't use black outlines unless it's like a real stylistic choice you're going for. Try to avoid pure black. But also, like, key understandings of lighting, no primary source is, and that bounce lighting exists. If we look at the Owlboy ship right here, look at how much bounce lighting this thing. A good 20% of the bottom here is just reflected light. And that is huge for dimensionality. Don't forget that. When you're working on any kind of art, reflected light is like that just added a whole new dimensionality to my art. So I'd recommend experimenting with that. Get Sprite. There's like a way to like you do something for their website and they give you it for free. I don't know. I just paid the $15 on Steam and got it, and it's way worth it. It's literally like Photoshop but for pixel art with almost the same exact amount of functionality. Can't edit photos in it, obviously, but if you're doing pixel art, it is like you should have it. Yeah, what's up? Yeah. Actually, Sprite's really awesome for that because it comes with like the SNES color palette or the Commodore 64 palette or even the original Game Boy, like all the shades of green they could put on the screen. So pick one of those palettes and say like, okay, I'm not gonna use anything but everything that could exist in the game. And then think about like, so they could use that palette, but they could only put so many of those colors on screen at once. So do some research, find out how many colors the Super Nintendo could have on screen at once. Make an asset that is as efficient as possible. Make a scene that doesn't use any more than that number of colors. In terms of just like general, like picking colors for games or for art in general, learn some color theory. If hopefully you know your color relationships, you know, complementary colors, but you also got split complementary. You've got the, you know, the square, just all those cool shapes you can make on the color wheel to give you a good color scheme. Because yeah, that really helps you. There's a book by the guy who made, he did paintings for Dinotopia, I think. It's called Color and Light. Yeah, by James Gurney. Get this book. Get this book, and then also get maybe less so imaginative realism by him. But this book is all about how light affects things and how to render that effectively. These concepts go straight into pixel art, go straight into like rendering for 3D, things like that. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Anybody else? Cool. Hopefully you enjoyed the talk. Thank you. I'm Dewey. I'll be around. I'm helping with 247, but I can also help you with any art in your games and stuff like that. So yeah, thank you.